So part of the research in my lab aims to understand the seasonality of infectious disease. So basically the main question for us is why do some infectious disease peak at specific seasons of the year? So it's a very old observation. I think everybody knows about the fact that some infectious diseases are actually seasonal with kind of big peaks during specific seasons. But even though it's been observed and known for a long time, it's still the mechanism that causes this seasonality are still not very well understood for many infections. So in the lab, we examined two specific hypotheses that could explain this seasonality. The first one proposes that climate is actually the driver of seasonality. Climate, for example, temperature and humidity, we hypothesize that it could affect the infection, transmission, or disease by a given pathogen. A second hypothesis is related to pathogen interactions. So it's known from experimental studies, for example, that some pathogens can either cooperate or compete with one another. A famous example that many people know, for example, is that if you get influenza, it can actually facilitate a subsequent infection with a bacterium and cause disease, for example. If that's the case, that could also partly explain the seasonality of infectious disease. Because, for example, if you have pathogens that cooperate, they will tend to circulate together at the same season of the year, while in contrast, pathogens that compete with one another will try to avoid each other and to circulate at different times of the year. And so in the lab, we study this question and this hypothesis on different systems, but we have a focus on respiratory viruses, and in particular influenza, but also other viruses. So I think my research is relevant for at least three reasons. The first reason is from a scientific perspective. I hope my research will provide new insights into the biology of the infection we study in the lab. For example, an important conceptual implication of our work is that pathogens that interact form polymicrobial systems. And so really, if you want to understand these systems, you cannot study each pathogen in isolation, but you have to take into account these interactions to take kind of the big picture of these pathogens. A second reason why our research is relevant is for disease forecasting. So the hope here is that once we understand the climatic drivers of infectious disease, we might be able ultimately to better predict the probability or the intensity of epidemics in different climates or in a given climate that changes over time, for example. And the third reason is from a public health and control perspective. I think our result will have implications for this as well. And in particular to inform vaccination programs. So again, going back to this idea of pathogen interactions, if that's true, we expect that vaccines may have indirect effects, not only on the pathogen, the target, but also on all the other pathogens that interact. And so the general idea here is that maybe with just one vaccine, you would be able to catch two birds with one stone and to have an effect not only on the single pathogens, but potentially on many pathogens. Going back to my example of influenza that facilitates secondary infections with bacteria, we know there is a cooperative interaction in this case. So the hope, for example, is that if you use a vaccine against influenza, it might not only prevent influenza infections, but also secondary infection with bacteria, for example. To answer the questions and to test our hypothesis, we developed mathematical models of infectious disease transmission to describe the spreads of infectious disease in human population, a bit like the models people have heard about in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So first, what we try to do is to incorporate our hypothesis into these models. So for example, we might incorporate the hypothesis that temperature can affect the transmission of a pathogen, or the hypothesis that two pathogens can interact according to a given biological mechanism. Second, we try to confront these models to epidemiological data. We use statistics to do that, to confront these models to epidemiological data, and to try to see if an hypothesis is more plausible than the others based on the data. Overall, what we do is a mix of statistics, mathematics, and biology, but also of epidemiology and public health. So it's really an exciting field of research because we are at the interface of many different scientific disciplines.